Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the War Report. And we have quite a bit of news for you today, so we're going to start with what is surprisingly the smallest stuff. Now, this has been going on for a while. This has been a narrative they've been trying to craft to no avail, and it looks like that might just be disintegrating before their eyes. Now, of course, I'm talking about probably one of the most tragic events in recent American history, something that traumatized many and took the lives of many and really shook our democracy to its core, desecrated our sacred temple of democracy, that being the House of Representatives and the Senate. The building on Capitol Hill was just desecrated and completely trodden to the ground by these anti democratic rioters, these fascists, these people looking to stage a right wing coup. Of course, I'm referring to the horrifying events on January 6th, the next 9/11, if you will, as the narrative has been trying to paint. I can't keep this bit up anymore. But with that being said, they are now looking to form a January 6th commission to look into the horrors and the terrors of this horrible attack on our democracy, this unforgivable transgression by people dressed up like what was there? There was the shaman guy with the fur hat and the spear, and then like there was the one guy like in the American flag bodysuit with an eagle head thing, and there were all sorts of absurd costumes. I think the shaman does. I think he gets a little bit too much of the spotlight with everything else that was going on there. But what was it? What was it, that one guy who? There was one guy out there.
David Cross,
Yeah.
the guy
Uh, that's not what I'm
Jewish
referring to, but
in
there
New York.
there was that. But what I was referring to is somebody on Twitter. I'm trying to remember his name. Said something like this was as if the cast of National Lampoons reenacted the storming of the Bastille. That's honestly all I can say about it. And honestly, as time goes on, beyond the initial performative shock that you were supposed to have, I think that's the opinion of most people who witnesses. It was just an absurd event. It was kind of funny. These people were just okay. Number one, the guards, either as a honeypot or just because they didn't care, didn't really do their jobs and let them breach the Capitol. And they just wandered around, took pictures. Maybe they were a bit destructive, but it wasn't like what they do in a lot of these other countries, even first world countries. Well, they're like storming. I think Macedonia back in 2016, they burnt down the residence of the prime minister, something like that. And of course, even like in some of these state houses where you'll get these protests, those are a lot more violent. Like again, we talked about one of the ones that was a union dispute within the Wisconsin legislature. In the Ohio legislature, the BLM protesters last year actually breached the grounds, and there's several examples, again, as we went over on our episode with like that, on state and local legislatures being breached and being taken over by protesters temporarily. And this, honestly, it was a clown show. And again, to reiterate our episode reviewing that yet again, it was it was a show of apathy. It was a show that, well, who cares? Let's go into the Capitol building just because we can, because in dressed up like these morons. And again, they tried desperately to scrape a narrative out of this that this was some Trumpian coup, that this was Trump's last stand in order to reassert himself into power, trying to make Trump into this much more conniving, calculating, honestly more intelligent figure than he ever was. As they've been doing the whole time, they're taking this guy who, admittedly is a bit of a buffoon. I think he did good things to drive the narrative in our direction, to a degree. I won't take that too far. But ultimately, the man himself was just, again, kind of a buffoon, just a loudmouth New York celebrity billionaire. That's all Donald Trump really ever was. And trying to act like not only were these attacks this deadly event where horrible things happened and they took over the U.S. government temporarily, but it was all orchestrated by this one mastermind. And it looks like the Senate Republicans are set to really not go through this, put their foot down, and again, they need the 60 votes within the Senate to actually get a commission formed on this, and it looks like they are just going to be shy a few votes of actually getting that because Republican leadership in the Senate, to my surprise at least, actually cracked down and said, nope, you're not doing this, you're not voting for it. Now, if they would have tried doing this 2, 3 months ago, they probably could have gotten it through with a slim majority and had these investigations. But again, it's his attempt to desperately recreate a narrative where there isn't one. This attempt to get this boogeyman, get this punching bag back that they lost when Trump left office. Somebody, again, who they can just wail on and make the object of everything they oppose and everything they hate because I mean that's how the systems function for the last I would say at least 70 years if not longer, but point being is they've created this monster in Trump, and then they needed a successor. So they talk about all the evil and radicalism that Trump inspired, and lo and behold, your evil and your radicalism was the guy in the Davy Crockett hat, shirtless, with an American flag and a painted chest. Like, again, this guy who looks like he's at like some party or something. Like a guy who does not look like he's set to overthrow a government is what I'm getting at. But that is what they'll tell you. That is how they will paint it. They'll go into the QAnon stuff. Yeah, that's what I'm calling it now. I'm deliberately butchering it before anybody says anything because honestly, I don't give Copanon as I also like to call it any respect. I think the hysteria about it is hilarious, but ultimately, again, it is just Copanon and trying to act like that's another one they've really tried to make a boogeyman out of for the past few years. When literally the crux of it is, hey, maybe the United States government isn't an institution that's on our side. Now, of course, there's very mild versions, and there's versions that get into like the very deep, very conspiratorial territory that I don't necessarily agree or disagree with. I'll just put that on the record right here, at least for the sake of the show. But again, you have that, and really, I'm going to repeat myself yet again. It goes down to the attempt to make a boogeyman. Well, exactly, make a boogeyman where there isn't one. I'm repeating myself at that point, and really just this desperate attempt to revive a punching bag, especially as Biden's administration is middling to disappointing to say the least.
Yes, where to begin? Biden's administration is not having a very marked difference in outcome and in policies compared to Trump's. And we were told, particularly in 2020 and at the end of 2019, that there would be that we would see a difference. But Biden has not changed his policy on China. He hasn't lifted any tariffs that I know of. Sanctions still continue, and if anything, he is tougher on China than even Trump was. Now, that's relative. However, the Biden administration has been able to build upon what Trump had started. For instance, getting Australia to comply by applying pressure on China. What are some other examples? Well, he's continuing to build the wall. That was, I mean, that was the most white supremacist symbol of the 21st century, was it not? That's still going. Um, let's see. I mean, there is a difference. He decided to lift the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, something that only Trump had started. So and of course the upcoming summit, which we'll talk about later on, he's forced himself into a bind because although the media adores Biden, the fact of the matter is that he called Putin a soulless killer, but he's still going to have a summit with him, right? There's something nonsensical. We'll expand on this, but there's something nonsensical about that. So yeah, his presidency is not really. It's I mean, what can you say about it? At least the wall isn't being built by a racist.
Oh, of course.
And
Look,
so,
at least we have affirmative action on the committee to build the wall. That's all I'm going to say.
right, right. So, and maybe there were some clues that, like you say, if this had happened 2, 3 months ago, that is, if they had not decided to put scores of these men in solitary confinement for months and had waited during that whole time to create a commission into to investigate into the January 6th storming of the Capitol, uh, they might have succeeded. But you know, too much time has passed, and frankly, like some surprising news. So I don't know. I guess most of our viewers are familiar with the videos of the police letting the protesters in, waving them in outside to go on the grounds. One of those people that helped orchestrate this event was a BLM operative, John Sullivan. So the DOJ has actually charged Don Sullivan. I think this is the first time that I know of an actual BLM operative, not a supporter, not a marcher marching in solidarity with BLM, but an actual organizer.
And you get these
Uh,
sort of situations all the time with these people that are really professional activists without really an ideological bent. And the other example that this really reminds me of is whatever the guy who, one of the main organizers of the Charlottesville rally was, he worked at some very low level position in the Obama administration. But you have these people who, in my opinion, are basically provocateurs who organize these big protests that can only go
yeah.
wrong, and it doesn't matter whether they're left wing, whether they're right wing, just depending on who they want to shut up at the time. And as of late, it's been the right wing. But you go back, I don't know, maybe like a century ago, it was labor organizers, it was unions that they did these sort of people to. So this isn't anything new, where you have these people that are pretty much professional activists, and they get together and they get these things, and they get people who, look, I'm not going to call them stupid, because most of them are just normal people. Sure, they may have bad judgment, bad instinct to actually go to these things, but people who are just, again, generally normal everyday people who have a strongly held conviction, whether that be support for Trump, whether that be wanting to see Confederate statues stay up, and they lead them into this meat grinder.
Right, and I mean the FBI came out and said so as much. That many of these people were tracked on Telegram and other social media. They were well aware of these people, so it was a honeypot. Like with John Sullivan, for instance. Um, a lot of people gravitated around him. I think there was even a freelance CNN reporter that hung around with him, a female. I forget her name, but the DOJ has not only charged him, but they've seized the $90,000 that he's made from a video that he produced about the killing of Ashley Babbitt. The actually, the only actual fatality at the Capitol. The only actual person who died at the Capitol, right? She was shot from behind, not presenting any danger, in the neck, and died. Like, the fact of the matter is, that was the only, that was the real violence. That was the only death, a Trump supporter. And as you said, the media will try to spin this as if I can't even pronounce his name. That police officer, you know. Well, he didn't die at the Capitol. He died the next day. He died of heart failure. And the fact of the matter is both coroner reports indicate he did not suffer any blunt force trauma. There is no linkage with any kind of injuries that led to his heart attack. So sorry. Um, but you still see CNN today pushing that. The mother of the police officer who died, he did not die at the Capitol. He did not even die on the same day. Pushing for the investigation. Everything is emotional manipulation. Uh, so it's hilarious that they're trying to do this, and of course I understand why, because like the Trump impeachment efforts, this is something that they will try to milk for the entirety of the 4 years. They will try to give you the illusion that there's Mitch McConnell is really running the country, and it's Biden who's actually under siege in the White House, um, which is preposterous. right?
Wait, so
But that, that
are we gonna get a shitlib version of QAnon where it's actually Biden's secret long term plan against the Republican quote unquote deep state or whatever they're gonna call it in Mitch McConnell's regime, and he's working to overthrow that? Is that I I wouldn't be surprised if I saw those takes crop up among the sort of a copanon for the left, if you will.
yeah. So I just find that I just find that so funny. I mean, our listeners are well aware of these tactics. So yeah, hopefully it fails. It will certainly be quite a deflation, unlike the economy. So
No, no.
yeah, I look I look forward to that.
Yeah, that also reminds me, just as a very small piece of news, Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary out there, is coping that the U.S. debt will be manageable for the next decade. Yeah, okay. I believe it. I don't know about you, but I believe it, certainly. And with that being said, just continuing on domestic news, Georgia and Arizona, the peach state, not the Caucasian one. We'll get into the caucuses later. Don't worry. But there's been some election audits about 6 months too late, 6.5 months too late, that are starting to reveal, maybe these elections in Georgia and Arizona and a few of these other states weren't exactly as straightforward as we were led to believe. Maybe they weren't as fortified as we were led to believe. Now, of course, these are now coming out, pretty much rubbing in that, like, yeah, you know, we took these states from you. There's nothing you can do about it, and hell, we'll do it again. That's what it feels like on the part of the current ruling administration, the current regime, that, yeah, we overthrew Trump. What are you going to do about it? And we're going to outright admit to it, and we're going to rub it in your face. That's what it feels like to me, which is the reason they're
Yes.
admitting that. And it also gives the right a bone to chew on, saying, oh, look, we're vindicated. Look at this. We were right. Well, they continue to lose on every other cultural, political, and social issue. They can gloat about how they were right about an election that is long over, about a president they put way too much stock in for way too long at that point. I mean, I would say, again, after after November, what was it, November 8th, when the media outlets started calling the election for Biden, I could see sticking your neck out for Trump. But I don't know, after mid December, after the Electoral College had their convention, I think putting your neck on the line for Trump and going back to the January 6th thing was just a fool's errand. Now, the past is the past, but just a critique of the right in America, which, again, I'm sure this will just help them soar to victory because they're in such a prime position for it, but that's aside the point. I think they put their eggs in one basket, that being Trump, and I think they're continuing to make that same mistake, saying, look, Trump, he actually won this, and we can turn around, and Trump 2024, and as much as I'd love 4 more years of Trump acting like a buffoon and making everyone in the media and the establishment angry, I ultimately don't think it's a good idea in a broader picture, but again, that's aside the point. We'll talk more about 2024 when the time comes, when 2024 actually rolls around. But again, with that being said, all things considered, you do have this, and again, I understand the feeling, the desire to say, well, yeah, of course we were right. They took this right out from under us, but at the end of the day, all I can really see this as, these admissions coming out, these audits being allowed to happen, is just them bragging about it, just them mocking us to our
Yeah.
face. Well, us isn't like the right in general. I know our audience is pretty split on the Trump question, and even myself, I'm pretty split on the Trump question. But again, just the general right wing in America just feels like something they're just shoving your nose and saying, look what we can do, we own you, we rule you, and we'll do it again if we want.
Yeah. And it's amazing how, like, a lot of, well, I mean, I understand all the preparation for this moment. They spent 4 years convincing a huge swath of the population, if not to believe, but at least to repeat the lie that Trump was going to introduce the Fourth Reich. There were going to be death camps. Um, millions of people. He was going to deport more people than Obama. He didn't even get to like a third of Obama, and that's compared to first or second term Obama. So none of this happened. Um, remember all the stupid shows like, um, oh, the one based on the Margaret Atwood novel. Like, I mean, they used every single liberal triggering emotional issue to create the illusion of an America that doesn't exist, even an America that never existed. So um, that I guess that went in a long way, so that if rigging the election is something that is going to remain with at least 35 to 40% of the population in America, the other will say, well, so what? It's what we had to do to save democracy. You see how that works, right? Um, Democracy is a peacetime activity, right? You have to preserve it. You have to do things. Anyhow, I mean, I think also it was a laughing stock. I think a lot of countries, no matter what their relationship to America is, January 16th, I think, was important as a kind of laughing stock label that you could put on America. America kind of basically threw away all its political cachet that it had won after the fall of the Soviet Union, and it began doing so many things unilaterally that didn't make sense. It destroyed its own reputation because of its global ambitions.
Yeah, and once again, I'll
Because of
I'll
its
say not only was it a unilateral power, not only was it a country that acted without impunity and as an imperialistic power, but to no avail either. Because I make this point all the time. You can criticize the conduct of, for example, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, but at least at the end of the day, you can look at it and you can at least see what goals they were trying to accomplish. Now, you can see the kind of goals America accomplished, but really, in terms of preserving an empire, there's no rhyme or reason. This is just the act of plundering and enriching one's own personal wealth. Now, of course, that happens with every empire, but at least the leaders of empires of old had the foresight to see that we have to build a sustainable system in order to keep the cash flowing in. Whereas the American elite, for whatever reason, just hey, how much juice can we squeeze out of this before we throw it away? That's at least the way I see it.
Yeah, yeah. So I think in that sense, because the the Trump administration forced a lot of masks to drop to the floor, and then finally it ends. All of it ends in a farce that, frankly, makes America look like a farce. Right down to AOC claiming that she still suffers from PTSD and has to see a therapist. It's just the most absurd thing you've ever heard. The 4 years that included Jussie Smollett telling us that white supremacists in Chicago tried to hang him, or you know, it's in or drink bleach or
I
whatever it
I
was.
can't remember who it was, but I know I think there were actually several people out there who just kept a running list of fake hate crimes that were committed under the Trump administration. And
Yeah,
all these things that turned out to be like, oh, this black guy wrote the N word on his own garage door, or again the
right.
classic swastika on a synagogue. Where did that come from, Mr. Goldstein? Like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that they went exponentially. That isn't to say that there weren't, crimes of, the real sort did take place. The shooting at the synagogue in Pennsylvania, the shooting in Texas at the mall on the border. To be fair, but there was a
Yeah,
whole
and that's not
slew
even
of
getting
crimes.
into like the Antifa stuff and the Steve
Yeah,
Scalise assassination attempt and all that sort of stuff. Like,
right,
like in
right.
an unstable society, political violence is going to be abound regardless of whatever view you have. Now, I think one is much more tolerated, one is much more covered up, and I think you can guess which one I'm getting at. But that's aside the point.
Right, and further to that point is that these sort of things have been going on in America in an exponential way, really, for the last 20 years, regardless of who's in power. And they're probably going to continue. You could bring up the Las Vegas shooting. I mean, he basically just targeted white people, like 57 of them. To this day, the greatest mass shooting in American history. Um, but whatever. I mean, not to drift off topic, but uh, yeah, if they don't get this, they're really going to have to invent something that poses a threat. It's only posing a threat to democracy that everyone from CNN to the Democrat Party to like just the basic ideology of the cathedral can be maintained and legitimized, right? This is all to legitimize it, right? So, for instance, the audits that are currently going on, I believe there was one in Georgia that proved 30,000 votes were cast. These are absentee ballots. None of them folded. How can you get an absentee ballot if it's not folded, let alone 30,000 of them? They're all folded to go into an envelope. You get them by mail, right? Um, Second of all, they're not even printed on the official paper that was used for that entire state. So something is up. I think a lot of people realize that, and it's kind of sad actually that the right wing was so invested in seeing Trump lose. Like I thought that was just one of the most miserable things I'd ever seen. Not because I like Trump or care about Trump necessarily. I mean, you and I have basically had a very pragmatic approach to him and why his presidency was ultimately, a good thing. Uh, Not for the reasons that Republicans think it was a good thing, of course. Um, but so yeah, the audits are going on, and I would I would suggest just like the contradictions in the upcoming Russia summit, they're doing their level best to ignore them, and I think that's what we're going to see. They're going to ignore them. Um, as long as they can get one or two states where you can't prove the audits were rigged by a huge margin, they won't care. And if they get some kind of you know uh, ardent supporter of the regime, then they will argue that, well, it's what we had to do to save democracy. I'm not sure it was really rigged, but it's what we had to do. But you know, I'll say one more thing. There was a recent article that was published by about Facebook and how they helped fortify the election. Now, Facebook, of course, dumped hundreds of millions of dollars and were part of those companies that war gamed the 2020 election a year before it was ever cast. And they were one of those companies that were cited back about July, late July, when CNN was telling you how the election results were going to go. Remember that? So we know Apple and Microsoft and a load of other huge multi-billionaire, uh, billion-dollar companies that have offices all over the world were invested to see Biden win. But how far did they go? Well, they designed absentee ballots for felons. Uh, they also had I could be wrong, but the term was something to the effect of vote shepherds or vote trailblazers. These are people that went to homes and told people how to properly vote, right? Because if they make a mistake, well, uh, it won't be counted. So amazing fortification was going on. And you wouldn't believe that a corporation could ever be, the same corporations that have lawsuits for sending private information to other corporations that's against the law, those guys would never lie, right? It's preposterous, right?
They're very honest.
American
Okay,
election, American,
one look at Mark Zuckerberg. Okay, I can just tell by his physiognomy that's a very trustworthy man right there.
right? Even their fact checkers are their own people, like as if that's a neutral position, right? So it's frustrating, it's annoying, but ultimately the more they talk about this, the more obvious it is that it's yet another institution that has lost legitimacy. And as I said, it's just as important that America loses legitimacy over its institutions here as well as abroad, right? Um, America squandered like a lot of it in terms of, say, the power of diplomacy, the power of world leadership with its fake permanent wars in the Middle East based on lies. But but now it's doing it on through its domestic institutions, and it's showing that it's a corporate run entity, right? And you know the government can't really decide what to do, so the corporations are going to decide. All civilizations plan themselves, right? The idea that this happens organically or you can leave it up to the market is preposterous. It's stupid. Everyone, every society has had to plan their future. That's how we got here. You know, that's how you create time preference or K versus R selection, right? Like that's how it's done.
Yeah, it's all about somebody taking action. And look, if the state apparatus is not going to take action, if the government is not going to take action, who else is besides the people who rake in millions, if not billions, of dollars a year?
Yeah.
And with all that being said, I suppose that covers our domestic news. We can move into a little bit of Middle Eastern news. That in Syria there was a pretty big election and it was very close, and I was worried there, but
Uh,
Bashar
a lot.
al-Assad has very narrowly clinched victory with 95% of the vote. And really, I will say unironically, I do think he won a more legitimate election than Biden did. And look, I'm not going to deny that Assad's a dictator. I kind of admire the guy for it, if I'm going to be honest. Okay, I'm not a big fan of democracy. I'm not a big fan of these sort of liberal enlightenment concepts. If you haven't picked that up by now, but it's not unprecedented, and to make a case for him actually winning this election legitimately, it's not unprecedented for a wartime leader to win in such a landslide. I know during World War II in the UK the you had what was virtually a unity government where they all united around at of course Chamberlain first and then Churchill. It's pretty much saying forget political debates. We're in the middle of a massive war. You had, again, just going back to the World War II example in the United States, in the 1944 election, even the 1940 election, I know the U.S. wasn't technically in the war at that point, but pretty much everyone knew what direction it was going in. FDR won in a landslide in both his elections, not that he didn't in the previous elections, but still. Again, when there is wartime in a democratic system, and I'm not necessarily calling Syria a democratic system, people will tend to not want to change the power of the
Yes.
administration. That's a big joke and meme that goes around in American political conversation a lot. That ex-president is going to start a war, or they started a war just to stay in office. People made that joke about Bush. People made that joke about LBJ, etc. Where, and those were far off overseas wars in the form of Iraq and Vietnam, where it didn't affect the American public directly. Vietnam, even with the draft, still didn't affect the vast majority of the American population. It wasn't anything compared to the World Wars, or even going even further back to the Civil War. Yeah, Lincoln is another example of a wartime leader winning an overwhelming majority in an election. But again, not saying Syria is democratic, not that I care, but it's not unprecedented for wartime leaders to have that kind of support. And you looked at the areas that were actually allowed to vote in Syria. They were the areas under government control. So just to pull up the map now, everything in red was the electorate, whereas of course the Kurdish controlled areas and the rebel controlled areas didn't get to cast their ballots because, number one, why would the government accept them from those areas? Number two, why would they participate in the election, especially with the so-called FSA and the other rebel groups in northwestern Syria? When their goal is to overthrow the government, I don't see them participating in their presidential election. But that's side of the points. Even though I hear out of the Golan Heights, 100% of the votes went for Trump. But that's aside the points.
That was good.
Yeah. I came up with that one on the spot. I didn't even plan that one. I usually plan out these jokes. I'll give you a little spoiler, a little behind the scenes look for our audience here. But that one I just came up with on the spot. But with all that being said, of course, Assad is in power until 2028, and probably for the rest of his life, or until he steps down, or until the international powers and maybe even Russia force a new constitution, new leadership on Syria. Which, who knows the fate of post-war Syria? It's something we speculated on for a long time, but I wouldn't be surprised if ultimately post-war he was forced to retire by the big powers of the region and of the world. But that's entirely different concept, entirely different topic for a different day. But there has been
I,
activity in northwestern Syria, in Idlib. Russian and pro-government strikes do continue on rebel groups. You do get the cleaning up of ISIS in the Deir ez-Zor region, and there were some. We're back to the trend of American patrols being routed by Syrian and Russian forces in northeastern Syria. Again, just there wandering in circles and serving no real purpose except being a tripwire. There was some activity in southern Syria near the Jordanian border, some skirmishes, but I know it will sound like a contradiction, but a pretty slow week out of Syria in general.
yeah, and overall, slow is good because a lot of Syria is rebuilding. There are Syrian refugees who are returning to their homes. In many cases, whatever is left of them, sadly. And to your point about the Kurd votes that aren't being like, I'm sorry, but if if Republicans wanted to create an ethno state, like, would you count their votes as being legitimate? Would you consider anything they do legitimate? No, you wouldn't. So I mean, of course, Assad is in the same position, right? He's not going to consider somebody who wants to overturn the sovereignty of the country. And in this case, it would be the sovereignty of the country would be overturned to ISIS, or it would have been overturned eventually to America, or a deal between the two. So, yeah, you know what? Like, that's what happens. I mean, libs have always said, like, what are you going to do with your militia groups? You're going to get mowed down. It's like, yeah, Assad is doing literally what you're saying you're allowed to do. It just, I can't even believe they lack the introspection to see that, right? So, um, yeah. So I think, you know, I saw a video about a day or two ago of Assad. It was, I think, around 2000, late 2017. Aleppo had been liberated, and he's driving around, and he's just quietly speaking to the cameraman inside the car as he's driving, and he says, eventually they will leave. They will have to leave. The Americans are leaving Iraq. They will have to go. Which is ironic because it was still at that time that we once in a while heard the adage, Assad must go, Assad must go, Assad must go.
I
I
would
mean,
look.
Assad is
I know you're saying that in
literally
context, but I think you might be jinxing yourself. I'd watch your back for the next few days.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Biden will go before Assad does.
Oh, absolutely. And I saw the other day five leaders, and again, I want to get the specific ones, but I know that Blinken was on Twitter kvetching about it, and he was talking about sanctions on Syria, and I just need to pull up the exact five countries that, because it looks like we're in for a 5-1 Assad curse right here. And yes, it was Anthony Blinken, quote from Twitter: "The Assad regime's so-called presidential election is neither free nor fair. The U.S. joins France, Germany, Italy, and the U.K. in calling for the rejection of the regime's attempts to regain legitimacy without respecting Syrian people's human rights and freedoms." So, and okay, so you got Biden, you got Macron, you got Merkel, you got who the hell is the prime minister of Italy at this point? Do they switch out again? Is it still Conte? I think it might still be Conte, but um, it beats me. Who knows? And you have Boris Johnson. Now, all five of those, Merkel is guaranteed to step down in September, But the other four, I mean, Biden could croak at any moment. Macron is up for election in 2022. Italy is, I mean, I think you just saw how quickly their governments change, and who knows what will happen with the Conservative Party or UK elections in general. So we could get, honestly, I do genuinely believe all five leaders of those countries will be out of office before Assad is.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, no go. So a quiet week in Syria is a good week for the Syrian people. Uh, that's going to be my new adage.
I think there's really no better way to put it, and we'll just see. We'll just see how it goes, and we'll see how it plays out. But again, I think Assad's bluster is warranted in this case. That we're leaving everywhere else. We're withdrawing troops from Germany. At least under Trump, we were. We're withdrawing forces from Iraq, from the other parts of the Middle East, and just a general global retreat. And I fail to see why Syria wouldn't be an exception eventually. I think it'll be one of their last holdouts because I mean, they're even withdrawing from Afghanistan at this point, as we've gotten into. And there was some violence in Afghanistan this week we'll touch on briefly. But again, I don't see the U.S. presence in Syria. I think, especially after Biden waived Nord Stream, and maybe it is the Biden administration, maybe it's general geopolitical trends, maybe it's a little bit of both, but I think Biden is throwing up the white flag on a lot of issues, or at least whoever Biden's handlers are throwing up the white flag on a lot of issues because they sort of realize that Trump's campaign rhetoric from 2016, as much as they hate to admit it, was right. Except they squandered the past 4 to 5 years writing Trump off and demonizing him rather than listening to the points that at least he was a mouthpiece for. Again, I still think a lot of those points, love him or hate him, came from the mind and mouth of General Michael Flynn, who was Trump's original national security advisor, that geopolitically, culturally, in pretty much every aspect, America is in dire straits. And we need, at least on the geopolitical level, something of a retreat and reshoring and fix our issues at home, and then we can continue to function as a major player on the world stage. We won't be completely unchallenged. Russia and China and the European Union and various other powers will rise in the power vacuums that we leave, but it's a much better fate than collapsing in on ourselves, which I think is happening right now. And I think he will not be credited for it outside of our sort of circles. And even in our sort of circles, people don't like Mike Flynn. I can see why a lot of people don't like Flynn. He is very Zionistic. He does have his views, but I do think he's a brilliant mind nonetheless. And you have all of this, but I do think that especially the mainstream historiography, if you will overlook his contributions, his ideas on this when America, as it's currently happening, does collapse in on itself, that he will not be credited for having great foresight on this. Or maybe he will by some people, or maybe it will be one of those topics that's heavily disputed for the next 400 years. Who knows? Whatever. But again, I think at the end of the day that the administration proper, especially when the Democrats proper got back in office and when Biden got back in office, realized that, hey, maybe Trump may have been a blusterous dumbass, but I think at least his administration, at least his foreign policy team, his original foreign policy team, might have had a point here and there.
Right. And I mean, to that end, you could also argue that Biden, after scrapping the investigation into the origins of the COVID virus, has now reopened them. And I mean, we're all aware of Fauci now being duplicitous, um, saying, "I never said it," was definitely from a, as he calls it, an animal reservoir. In this case, the Chinese wet market in Wuhan. But we should remember that even so-called patient zero does not show, of the 40 initial cases that they studied, 14, including patient zero, not show signs of what would be called like a naturally evolving virus. Uh, in other words, suggesting that it could have been grown in a lab, that it had accelerated under different circumstances than that of a wet market or animals living in close confinement. So that's yet another thing. So yeah, it's rapidly shifting, and maybe this kind of footing is going to play an important role in June when uh, Putin and Biden finally meet in Reykjavik for their summit.
Now, I do think you're getting a little bit ahead of the curve. I have some of that set for later. I just want to round out the Middle Eastern news before we get too much into that. So,
Sure, sure,
just to put a
no problem.
bow on the Israel-Palestine issue, because that has very much simmered down, I still reiterate the take I've had for the past couple episodes that this was the extremely high risk, extremely low reward prospect, at least in the short term, for the Palestinian cause with this all out full frontal assault on the Israelis, on Tel Aviv with the rocket attacks. And again, it looks like maybe beyond some sympathy in the Western world and outside the Western world and China putting out their very interesting news piece about why America supports Israel, etc. It doesn't look like they made out that well. It looks like, again, Israel has yet another excuse to push further into the West Bank, to blockade Gaza even further, squeeze them out even more. And again, I do think any semblance of a Palestinian state, unless there's a massive reverse of fortunes in the Middle East, such as Iran and the Axis of Resistance, as they call themselves, does wage that final all-out assault on Israel and brings down the Zionist entity, which who knows at this point. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but give it 10 years, who knows how ridiculous with I if you looked at the world, if you were sitting in 2011 and thinking about what's the world going to be like in 2021, I can almost guarantee you think none of this would be real, that we're just making this up.
Absolutely.
Um, so, I don't know, in 2030, 2031, Iran and her allies destroying Israel, I don't think is that outlandish of a guess. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's not something that you have to say like, oh, there's no way that would never happen. But again, I'm getting off on a tangent. But I think, barring some major event that strikes a crippling blow at Israel, I think the any semblance of a Palestinian state, any semblance of Palestinian people, will be gone for the foreseeable future. I do think they will clear out the West Bank. I think they will go hard on Gaza, clear out Gaza, and Palestinians will just be yet another diaspora and refugee group if they're not assimilated into the broader populations of neighboring countries such as Jordan, such as Syria, such as Egypt, etc. And again, we'll see how that plays out. I don't know, maybe the Jordanians are the wild card. Maybe their relationship with Israel is falling apart. But again, if things continue on the current trajectory where Israel has the steady peace with their neighbors to the south and to the east in Egypt and Jordan, and has this slow burning war with Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria and Iran, I do think that they will assert control over the entirety of the disputed territory within the next few years here. Not that I'm saying that's a good thing, not that I'm saying I support it, but I think that's just the way things are going to be, and the Palestinians are going to be displaced by the millions, even more so than they already are.
I would maybe make a counter argument to that, and that is, I don't think Israel wants to go into Gaza, and I think they're actually too afraid to do so. The big lesson for Israel is that, unlike the last Intifada, which was fought with rocks against tanks, this is not going to be that way. You have to imagine how in the world did this tiny strip of land acquire thousands of missiles, uh, with some with very good accuracy, and kept Israel in suspense for so long and stopped a land invasion. So I don't think so. I think actually Israel has been halted for the time being.
Fair, fair, but I would make the counter argument that they're feeling the pressure that they need to act swiftly and act fast because they're on such a crunch. And again, I've gone over this on previous episodes throughout the past, gee, how many years at this point? How many years have we been doing the show? Like three. That I think they will be pushed to take drastic actions by a fear of that exactly. Now, whether that will succeed or not, maybe they'll overplay their hand, especially in Gaza. Who knows? But I do think you have a
I think
point.
I think the event already came and went. I think it was now. I
Huh.
mean, I think if Israel was actually serious about finally clearing them out, they had no better reason than what just took place a few weeks ago.
So you're
Whether
telling
you
me
want,
you're telling me Israel's more of a paper tiger than I thought. Now, I'm not saying that's unbelievable, but man, I'm a little bit floored that I think you might have a point. Is what I'm getting at.
well, I mean, what would you wait for? I know you can make the argument that okay, yeah, but in peacetime we'll do it. Well, I mean, yeah, you had peacetime, you aggravated them, and they fought back. Now, sure, you killed 250 some odd people, but I mean, that's a fraction of what you did during the first Intifada. It's literally a fraction, right? And they destroyed important infrastructure, so which is stopping from investors investing into your country because Israel has big dreams of becoming this world trading hub as America continues to go into decline. That is going to be like a clover leaf. It's going to link Africa, Asia, and Europe together, right?
Wait. So you're telling me
Well,
that the country full of Jews has mercantile aspirations?
but so what I'm saying is I remember way back when Israel was so proud of destroying this and that tunnel. Well, I mean, okay, you've been destroying tunnels for decades, but like, who would have thought that they had those kind of weapons? I mean, that's come on. I mean, you really. I mean, what the Palestinians did in 1 week was a joke compared to what Saddam Hussein was doing for several weeks, with the so-called Scud missiles. This was really well done. I mean, yeah, you're not going to see like you're never going to see an outright victory from the Palestinians, but the truth of the matter is like here's your chance, Israel, go in and invade. Now's the time. But that time has come and gone. And they didn't because they refused to do it. I think the Palestinians called their bluff. And the Palestinians are playing a long game. They're playing a waiting game. Nasrallah actually said, this is Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has claimed that like the next attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque will see action coming from other countries where I guess Hezbollah is stationed. I think you're going to see more Hezbollah and Hamas coordination. I really do, and this is going to make a ripple effect even in some areas of the Persian Gulf, but it will make a ripple effect in Egypt. It will make a ripple effect even in Syria. I think they're well aware that America is in a state of retraction and that Israel cannot survive without America,
You know,
no matter what its ambitions are.
I think you have a lot of good points, and you're sort of convincing me. But I am a bit concerned that you're making the optimistic argument here instead of me.
No, okay, yes, I see what you mean. Yeah, that's usually my job. But
Yeah, like I feel like we're making each other's points right now, in at least in this segment here. But I think you have some points, but like again, I think it all comes down to these next few weeks, like within the final fallout of this. What does Israel do? And I think that will be the very telling thing. And again, if they are stupid enough to do this again, I could see Nasrallah's words coming to pass with a um, pan-Arab, maybe pan-Islamic, whatever you want to call it, consciousness against the state of Israel, especially if they wait for America to have another another horrible overdose in police custody, as we are. At least this week is the year anniversary of certain events, but we,
yes.
we won't get into that. We might get into that next episode, but this one at least, and that's not really the focus. But again, pretty much we've said everything we can say about that. I think everyone has at this point. But moving on from that to Afghanistan, just briefly, it does look like violence is picking up. The Taliban is threatening new action, and that a lot of Taliban factions are walking away from peace negotiations, which You had, again, those start under Trump in 2018, 2019, continued by the Biden administration. You had, of course, Biden come out and saying, our final withdrawal will be on September 11th, 2021, for the big symbology of 20 years of it all. Tear in the eye, all that claptrap. But with that being said, um, it does look like the U.S. is dedicated to retreat, but it looks like the Taliban is realizing that there's really no point in negotiating with a power that's going to be on its way out anyway, and that, again, we are kind of turning tail and running, which admittedly we need to do after 20 years of this. It looks no more pathetic than continuing this ridiculous sort of war we've been fighting since October, November of 2001. But it does look like the Taliban is emboldened, and I imagine you will see a lot more sectarian infighting in Afghanistan, as is the case, because again, the Taliban might be the main resistance against the United States, and they might be the main armed group there, but they're by no means the only groups there. Of course, there's all these different tribal, ethnic, and religious differences that they will fight over. It's just that the Taliban has a united front because they're against a common enemy. And that does bring up the question: will the Taliban stay united in a post-American Afghanistan? We could see an interesting situation there where, like the Mujahideen after driving out the Soviet Union, they do fracture and infight among each other and create almost a second civil war state, prolonging conflict in Afghanistan, which I'm not saying is going to happen, but I would say out of all the almost predictions I make, that's probably the most likely to actually come to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a few articles about both the Taliban and America possibly involving themselves in some of the states surrounding Afghanistan. So, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and so on. One was that, the U.S. is looking for the possibility of having bases hosted um, in one of these other Central Asian countries bordering Afghanistan. Uh, Pakistan, Iran are totally out. I do not foresee that. I suppose Uzbekistan might be a candidate.
Well,
I
I
don't
figure
know. I mean, they
Kyrgyzstan and
certainly,
Tajikistan would be the smallest, just little fragments of Soviet republics left. And I believe it was Kyrgyzstan
yeah,
that a few months ago was having political upheaval and a change in administration. So I could see it there, and I believe that until about 2011, 2012, the U.S. actually operated a small air base out of Tajikistan. So I could see this being just a shifting of a base of operations in Central Asia from Afghanistan to another Central Asian country. As you said, Iran and Pakistan, barring regime change, are out of the question. But again, I could see an American presence crop up in, again, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, uh,
yeah.
yeah, and Kazakhstan, which is also, I know Nazarbayev. He's technically part of the presidential council, trying to be an elder statesman type figure. But they recently had a change in the guard. He stepped down from his presidential role and handed off the reins to some no name. So we could see, among the political upheaval in Kazakhstan, and as tide changed there, yet another attempt at a color revolution in a former Soviet republic. Because a lot of these color revolutions had targeted the European front, the Western republics as they were known, such as the Baltic states, such as Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, etc. We might see them switch strategies and try to really push regime change in, or influence the politics of these Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, like Turkmenistan, like Tajikistan, like Uzbekistan. And who knows, we could find ourselves in a common struggle with Turkey again, trying to create a pan-Turkic front. And maybe that'll even stretch into a certain northeastern region of China known as what is it? What do they call it? East Turkestan at this point. But it could be a two-pronged approach where they try to empower these Turkic states. Now I know Tajikistan is technically a Persian state, whatever, but they try to empower these Turkic states in Central Asia as a wedge against both Russia and China. And that could be the big push now, because Afghanistan has clearly not succeeded. Because again, it trying to exceed as an empire in Afghanistan has historically been a fool's errand. So they may just be switching up tactics here. They may just be switching up a base of operations, as you said. And especially, of course, Kazakhstan would be the big prize with that. I think after Russia, they were the second. They were the largest former Soviet republic. I think it was Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, etc. I think those were the big three ones. But if you can get that one wedge right between Russia and China, that would be, of course, that would be the cream of the crop. But they'll take what they can get to have that wedge there. But I do think we will get a lot more activity in Central Asia as the American Empire does retract. That's one area that they will hold on to for dear life, even if they do abandon Afghanistan in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a way of keeping an eye on Afghanistan, but at the same time, it would be even more importantly a way of monitoring China's influence and expansion into that area. Like we said in previous episodes, China did have an agreement to start developing certain mining operations within Afghanistan because Afghanistan is very rich in minerals, minerals that are very important for the manufacturing of what the Chinese call like luxury electronic goods. So, it might surprise people that the big exports coming out of China are actually like phones and laptops. Um, so that's a real possibility, and it would also be a way of reducing, uh, let's say, Russian influence in that region. I'm very sure that something of that sort is being planned. But we'll see how it goes.
And speaking of Russian influence, just to round out the show, oh boy, what a week in Belarus! Can you believe that Lukashenko? Can you believe that Lukashenko personally hijacked a plane and forced it to land in Belarus? I couldn't believe it either. And
Yeah.
that's at least what you get from the media. This humble potato farmer out here just hijacking aircraft and forcing it to land. Where really, to understand the situation, correct me if I'm wrong because the story was so unclear with all the different information going around. There were five people of interest that Belarus wanted in their custody, so they forced this flight to land. They forced them so they could apprehend these people and take them into custody. Correct? That's what they're telling us, and then of course they're trying to make this into state-sponsored terrorism, state-sponsored kidnapping, where allegedly they used Hamas agents to land this plane. That's what actually happened. Trying to play on those old sentiments of Palestinian airline hijackers, but it's just it's one of the
Yeah.
more absurd narratives I've seen them try to spin lately. Considering the fact when it comes to international aircraft instances, whether that be the U.S. downing of the Iranian airline, or whether that be the Soviet downing of the South Korean airline, or whether that be the one Malaysian airliner that got shot down, or the fighting in Ukraine, which I do think it does beg the question: what was a civilian aircraft doing in an active combat zone at the time? That was 2014, 2015, where they tried to blame it on Putin just shot down this jet for no reason when, again, like I said, an active combat zone, but just ignore that part. And then again, some of the non-military related ones about these aircraft that have just gone missing. I think that one was also a Malaysian airliner that went missing somewhere in the Southeast
Indian.
Asian region, Indian Ocean. But again, they're trying to make this Belarus thing into a state-sponsored terrorism sort of thing, where they're saying
Yeah.
that Lukashenko is
It's
just terrorizing Western Europeans, etc., and that this put so many lives in danger. And this, of course, also Putin can reunite Russia and Belarus.
right, and I mean, I guess most of our listeners are savvy, so they know all about 2013 when Obama forced an airliner carrying rather Morales, the president of Chile, to land, and because he had hoped that Snowden was on the plane, and nobody said boo about that. Well, I mean that broke international law, and it also set a precedent. In many ways, America's leadership after the fall of the Soviet Union was so outside of UN regulations, which during the Cold War were more tightly adhered to, and if they weren't, I mean, I remember that time. The threat of all hell breaking loose in a nuclear war was far more real than it is now. And I think that kind of stricture made people abide by international law more often. Well, with the fall of the Soviet Union, it was more unilateral action, and you know, and in many ways, a lot of these states say, well, you know, if the Americans can do it, so can we. So you know, that leadership isn't really there. But the story is fascinating. So this is you know, the person in question that has been arrested is Roman Protasevich. So Roman Protasevich comes off as a journalist. You know, he's
Well, isn't that reason enough to
co-developer.
arrest him?
Hmm?
Isn't that just reason enough to arrest him?
Yes, well played. So Roman Protasevich has a rich history of a very active journalism. For instance, being part of the Azov Battalion. Every photo I've ever seen of Roman with the Azov Battalion, he's showing off really big guns. He's not like one of these American or Western European journalists that is wearing a flak jacket and a helmet. No, he's showing you the kind of gun he carries. We're supposed to believe that he went and fought, that he only went to cover the war in Ukraine when war broke out there. He didn't go and fight there. That wouldn't be Roman. Haven't you seen his mother crying on television? But the story gets even better because Roman Protasevich was in Greece. He was taking a flight from Athens to Vilnius, Lithuania. But who would he be meeting inside Greece? Just to deepen the Ukrainian connection, this is really really extraordinary. So he met with does everybody remember when Victoria Nuland said, fuck the EU? Does anybody remember who she said that to? Well, she said it to Jeffrey R. Pyatt. Jeffrey R. Pyatt was the ambassador to Ukraine during Obama's second administration from 2013 to 2016, and he's back on board as the ambassador to Greece. My bet is that Protasevich with Mr. Pyatt were concocting basically another coup attempt in Belarus for this summer because the last one was an abysmal failure.
And so was the assassination
And
attempt on Lukashenko. That also failed.
and
Where
the
there was,
assassination, and for Lukashenko, besides the assassination attempt, and you know, that got thrown under the rug because, well, you know, back in 2014 or something, this arms depot that had World War I and II munitions blew up, and we think it's those two Russian guys from Salisbury because they visited the place and then whatever. And then there was another explosion, but they weren't there for that one in December, so we don't know about that one. So that basically covered up the news over the assassination attempt. But I would bet that Lukashenko's revenge has more to do with the story that broke out just before his election, when the Ukrainians were clamoring that Russia is sending mercenaries to Syria. Like, I mean, who cares? Uh, but what the Ukrainians were trying to do, of course, was they too wanted to ground a plane that was a Turkish plane that would be leaving from Minsk and going to Ankara. Now that fell through. It didn't work. It didn't stop them clamoring, however, and that forced Lukashenko to investigate who were these guys. We saw the video footage of them that were, you know, that had boarded some kind of a, you know, it's one of these classic sort of Russian Eastern European five-story blocks, apartment buildings that are quite popular in those regions. So they were staying at one of these. They weren't found with any guns, but some of them were wearing military fatigues and so on. Anyhow, that story fell through, and it was obvious that Ukraine was trying to ginny this thing up. So my guess is, you know, I mean, this is such a precision hit, and Potrasevich really fell asleep on the wheel. Like this was either this was supposed to happen because there's internal fighting within his coup movement with Tiana or he just really messed up. I mean, he really messed up. The transcripts that I've seen indicate that from Switzerland that basically that the crew of the Ryanair said that they have decided to land in Minsk instead of Vilnius. Um, Now, I haven't heard anything from the crew themselves, just the transcripts. Uh, I don't know if they were forced to. There's certainly no confession indicating that uh, that they were forced to. I would say that going along with the bomb scare, which could be completely fake. Like I'm not saying this whole thing couldn't be completely fake. They were escorted by a MiG-29 of the Belarusian Air Force. So yeah, this is going to make probably interesting fodder for Biden, which again muddies my ability to decide whether he was meant to get caught or I mean he even posted his girlfriend posted on Instagram a photo of his or who's ever running his account that he got arrested before he was actually officially arrested. So maybe they knew it was coming. I don't know. In any case, there's a very good chance he's going to be a political prisoner for quite some time. Uh,
Hopefully
there's
forever.
others, hopefully forever. Lukashenko laughing JPEG. Lukashenko's going to go back to his potato farm and not worry about it. Um, yeah, this. I think his tie-in with Azov is going to play a really big role in swaying the Russian public and a good portion of the Belarusian public, because there have been fighters from Belarus who have gone to Ukraine to fight against the people of Donbass. There's Poles, there's Germans, there's Italians, there's Americans. One American was killed doing that, but they're there, and Swedes as well. But there's no criticism ever for doing that. But one Russian crosses the border into Donbass, completely unfair. So I would say that this is going to hamper the protests. They're going to be hard to spin because if I know that all these photos of him in the Azov battalion wearing the fatigues, the emblem, the whole thing, showing off his rifle, like riding in a tank. If that's the case, it's not going to become palatable to everybody in Belarus, right? And so we'll see really how far this thing develops. And of course the situation is completely escalated because now Russia is saying if you're not willing to fly over Belarus, you can't fly over Russia. So things are really, really rapidly escalating. In fact, quite frankly, it's starting to worry me. I am hoping that I'm hoping that Putin is just calling a bluff here or trying to call a bluff because this could be a kind of a preamble to like kind of a really a Cold War. So like a real Cold War, the kind that we used to have, not the kind that we talk about having.
Yeah, like a complete freeze over of relations, so to speak. And I do
Yeah.
agree. I think this has crossed several lines. I do think it is going to make it hard for a lot to come back. And again, I'd only see these events, especially with how much pressure is put on Belarus, making unification and integration between Russia and Belarus more and more likely. Ironically enough, moving it away from what the stated goal is. And at the end of the day, that like I think a lot of Belarus is starting to realize now at least from what I'm seeing, at least a lot of like the Belarusian leadership, Lukashenko, is starting to realize the only way not to get subsumed by the West, not to get subsumed by this, is we have to throw up the white flag. We have to throw up the tricolor, if you will, and join Russia. Now, I could be wrong. The situation on the ground could be much different from what I'm just seeing on the outside. But how many more of these coup attempts, these assassination attempts, is Belarus going to tolerate before they say, no, look, you're not gonna do at least the same magnitude to Russia what you do to us, because again we're a small former Soviet republic, just a little break off country of a few million people versus a global power, and that's at least the direction I see it going in, and I do think this is a very
Right.
very interesting.
And
Go ahead, go ahead.
all I was going to say is, I mean, as you mentioned, I just wanted to reinforce that EU leaders are worried now that despite their talk about how we're going to stop their exports of potash and oil, because just before the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia built this big refinery, and Belarus gets the oil super cheap. They refine it for other things, including kerosene. So it's a big business with a huge markup. Now, there are other companies in Russia that can absorb this loss, that can integrate it. But all to say that the EU is worried that this was a delicate balance. Like, you would want some kind of a change, but you would not want it to happen. Maybe, I don't know, in an inopportune at an inopportune time, or in a particular way that would force Belarus to integrate with Russia, because the integration with Russia and Belarus is far stronger than it was ever was with Ukraine. So
Well, it does make you wonder, especially in the question of the European Union. Of course, the Eurocrats will be completely up for it. They will be wanting to integrate Belarus, make Belarus part of their system. How many of the individual European countries and the people in general, think Germany with Nord Stream 2, have the stomach for another real Cold War? Especially with them being on the front lines, because the front lines, of course, would be pushed a little bit more eastward with Poland, with the Baltic states, with Romania, Ukraine, etc. But even still, how many Germans, how many Frenchmen, how many Italians? Now, probably the English would be more likely, and I'm not sure about the Scandinavians. I can't really say. I don't have too much political gauge there. But how many European countries in general will want to be the meat shields of the interests of people in Washington, of people like Joe Biden, Kamala Harris? And again, especially when it comes down to direct resources with, again, Germany and Nord Stream 2 and other countries that trade with Russia and buy energy resources from Russia, such as oil, gas. How many of them will have the stomach for another quote unquote Cold War? I don't think many.
yeah, I think we are living in a different time. Certainly, some of those pressures are still there. That's what geopolitics is. You see certain themes. If we're going to talk about Russia, where the invader is going to go if they're coming from Russia's western flank. So those sort of concerns will always persist. But I mean, we don't live in that ideological world the way we used to, and trying to ginny this one up with woke ideology isn't really going to work.
Yeah, and I
And
was actually just about to say that. It's not like they can say there's the threat of an international Bolshevik revolution, because Russia is just a run of the mill authoritarian state at this point. It's not a communist state, it's not a Bolshevik state. Ideology is not playing a role. America is certainly not what it was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And again, if anything, the more ideologically driven side, and you could argue that even during the first Cold War, the more ideologically driven side was the United States pushing this global liberal ideology. But again, at the end of the day, how many Europeans are going to stand up and maybe, of course, not even talking about a hot war, not even talking about a shooting war, but sour the relations with Russia over American interests in, for example, gay pride parades in Minsk, if we're being hyperbolic. Now, not even if we're being hyperbolic, but if we're just taking this to its most extreme extent.
Yeah, at what cost? Also, you get the feeling that I think even America's allies are realizing that America's unipolar moment has passed. All you have to think about is all you have to do to jog your memory about this is to recall what happened right after Biden was inaugurated. Uh, excuse me. The EU signed like literally the biggest deal of its lifetime with China. You
Yeah,
know,
outside
the
of in the European Union and NATO, outside of Poland, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states, who is enthusiastic about an American presence there? Maybe, for example, in Germany or in Italy or wherever, they aren't necessarily opposed to it. Maybe like, oh yeah, that's okay, they can stick around. But who is enthusiastic about it in significant numbers outside of Poland, the Baltics, and I don't know, maybe like somewhere like the Czech Republic?
very few. I don't know. Finland. That's all I can come up with.
Yeah, and again, I wish I had the maps on record, and I wonder what those, if especially if they did an opinion poll on that. Okay, about what 5 months, 4 or 5 months into the Biden administration, just doing a poll of European politicians or even just European people saying, do you want a closer relationship to the United States, or do you want to pursue your own path, or do you want to again do whatever? I'd like to see that sort of survey, that sort of study conducted again with a Biden presidency actually being a reality and not just Biden being a fill in for anyone who isn't Trump.
Right. And I think, you're getting at the heart of something here, and that is that I think a lot of Europeans, even the ones that are petrified of Russia, there's a because I mean Russia fear mongering in Poland and the Baltic states is a shibboleth. It works the same way gay rights and trans rights do in the West, right? If you're not for them, then you're against the country. Um, but I think a good deal of those people actually they don't want either. They don't want Russia and they don't want America, and they want to forge something that to them is European. That's something which is something only they can define, right? It's enormously complicated. It's probably doomed to fail, but there's probably some bedrock of truth there in so much as they've shared that land for so long. Obviously, there are going to be concerns about the extent of power that France and Germany will exert, but I do think that I do think they are looking for a third path.
Yeah, and I think
It's
that's where
ultimately
Macron and people like him are really striking a chord. The idea that we as Europeans, with our European values, which are more or less just as paused as what the current American regime is pushing on the world, but again, it's their own version of it, so it's okay. Sort of the old argument between French liberalism or English liberalism, but I suppose that's a bit reductionist, but it gets the point across. But yeah, I do think you're getting at a point that the Europeans as a unified bloc, and of course they don't all see themselves as Europeans, but they see they have more in common with each other than, for example, they have with the United States, China, or Russia, and they want to act as a more unified bloc on the world stage and even within their own countries, arguably.
yeah, yeah. So that's the difficulty presenting Europe. Um, the path that is the path that is best for them is probably the most complex and difficult one to chart.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, and this is all very interesting in the wake of the announced Putin Biden summit. Now, I do think that Biden is actually meeting Putin sooner into his administration than Trump did in his administration, so that will be a very interesting thing. They will be meeting in Geneva at one of these events. It's either UN or G20, or it's not G7, of course, because Russia got kicked out. It used to be the G8, but it's one of these big multinational events where a bunch of world leaders will be there, and they're having a sideline summit there. So we'll see what they negotiate. Now, of course, Putin partook in Biden's climate summit thing after Biden turned down doing the virtual summit with Putin after the Navalny incident, but it is an interesting dynamic, and I do think in terms of a potential actual second Cold War, this meeting will very much set the tone of U.S. Russian relations for these next few years, and I can only imagine what kind of super drugs they're going to put Biden on for this one, with how important it is. So we'll see how that works out. And
Right.
again, there's only so much we can do, just in speculation wise. So
Yeah, I mean, there's a few tidbits and clues, I suppose. Zakharova, you know, she's very lackadaisical when she talks about this upcoming summit, almost like we found a time that we could squeeze Mr. Biden into our schedule. She doesn't literally say that, but that's how lackadaisical she is.
yeah, like
Uh,
talking
it-
about
yeah.
like it's the Prime Minister of Denmark or somewhere insignificant like that.
So there's that, and then there's the other, as you mentioned. This is happening sooner than even Trump's summit with Russia, and we can compare those two because Mueller the day before released the 12 Russians that we think high probability. We can't show you the evidence that they helped sway the election through Facebook ads. I mean, Mueller literally did that just to spoil the summit. That was his job. But as I said at the beginning of the show, they're ignoring this because this makes no sense. Like, for Biden to call another world leader of such prominence, who's been such a thorn in the neoliberal side, particularly America's, who's kind of shamed them in a way, you would think that you would think that they would that he wouldn't attend the summit, that it would be a way to punish him. That they go to, I don't know, another location that shows that he's got the upper hand, that he would do something, that he wouldn't waive Nord Stream 2 sanctions. So I suspect that the media is just going to ignore this. They're going to do their level best to ignore it and not make it into a big deal. Republicans will go completely apeshit and accuse Biden of being too soft on the Russians. After 4 years of being called Putin's puppets, they're going to call Biden is the real Putin puppet. So I think that's what we're going to see. But as you mentioned, it's still like what, 3 weeks away almost. So we'll see.
Yeah, let me see how many days exactly because you gave
I
me an
believe in
itch
some.
I want to scratch since on the 16th. Today is the 27th as we're recording, and that would be again, yeah, 3 weeks. Actually, just shy of 3 weeks. So 20 days from now, they will be meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, to discuss a myriad of issues, presumably. And I can only imagine that meeting. I don't know how much of it's going to be an actual public press conference versus how much that's just going to be behind closed doors. We'll have to see. But again, I do think they're going to have to give Biden the super drugs, and I don't imagine they're going to leave him alone with one person for too long. Who knows what sort of nonsense he might get into with that sort of thing. But I do think that will be one of the more pivotal meetings of probably the just beginning of the century, honestly. For since 2000 onward, we'll really have to see how that works out, and that's really all you can say about it. I mean, and yeah, there's been a lot of big diplomatic shakeups, but especially when we have what is potentially a second Cold War, as you've been saying, on our hands, this could be one of those points that either makes it happen or prevents it from happening. I don't know. Maybe they'll reach some great breakthrough, or even just a minor breakthrough that prevents this sort of thing, or maybe again, we've seen Biden's propensity to throw up white flags on things like Nord Stream 2, on, again, several other things, and really focusing his efforts more on places like China, and, again, reconciling with Iran and sort of putting Russia on the back burner, which is really interesting considering his rhetoric leading up to and after he got elected. But, again, we'll see how that works out. And, again,
Yeah.
or this meeting could go very poorly, but, I mean, I do have to say, it's not like love him or hate him, Putin is a very good statesman. He's a very good diplomat. He's a very good negotiator. So I think even in a thorny situation like this, he can still navigate himself pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I think I mentioned this on the last show is if Biden is going to waive uh, Nord Stream 2 sanctions, maybe we're going to see some kind of capitulation from Putin. Um, this makes me doubtful because I don't actually think the Americans have really given up on sanctions. I could be wrong. Um, Plus, you know, it's already so close to being complete that I don't think even Biden suspects it's possible. I would say that probably nothing will happen, and within a few weeks, people will realize it, and it'll go back to Putin bad, dictator, more protests in Belarus. That cycle will start all over again. That's kind of what I see happening. I'm sure Biden has one or two people in his administration, maybe some advisors that are telling him to give Russia a deal to woo them away from China, but Russia is not going to budge 1 inch away from China. There is nothing America is willing to offer. The kind of concessions that America wants are all red lines for for Russia. Russia is not going to do it.
Well, it also does call into question, I think we'll figure out during this meeting, how influential is Blinken within the administration? How much is he just there to exist, just to fill the role of Secretary of State, versus how much of American foreign policy is he actively designing right now? Because, again, no surprise knowing Blinken, and of course, certain things about his ethnicity, certain things about his people, very hostile on the Russian question. And really, I think probably, especially with Biden being an absentee president, if you will, I would say it's almost entirely what we see out of American foreign policy right now. Even some of the concessions is mostly in the hands of Blinken. So it will be interesting to see how much they contradict each other, if they have a relationship like Trump and Pompeo did, where they're constantly just speaking past each other and saying contradictory
Mm,
things, or whether they'll be more in line. And I think this meeting will also give us a gauge on how much Biden and Blinken see eye to eye. I think that'll also be a very important revelation that will come out of this.
yeah.
But with all that being said, we're at an hour and 32 minutes, and I say of all worthwhile content, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the War Report. A little bit lengthier than I was expecting. But thank you everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.
Thank you. Take care.